Welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast, with me, Nathan Alexander, and my co-host, Todd Tavares. Moving beyond questions of God's existence, this podcast asks, what's next in a world without God? If you're enjoying the show so far, make sure to like and subscribe, rate and review, and consider supporting us on Patreon.
As Beyond Atheism looks to the future, when non-religious people develop a shared common cultural history, we here at the podcast often look back on what that history is and at the people who created it. To help us, today we are joined by Maddy Goodall, the Humanist Heritage Coordinator for Humanist UK. Maddy, welcome to Beyond Atheism.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much, Maddy, for coming on. Yeah, really looking forward to talking with you. Just to begin, well, can you tell us, one, what is the Humanist Heritage Project? And then, how did you get involved with it? Were you always a humanist, or what was the story there?
Yeah, sure. So, the Humanist Heritage Project was launched by Humanists UK in 2019 to mark 125 years of the charity, which had been founded in 1896 as the Union of Ethical Societies. So 2021 was their 125th anniversary. And the idea was to do just a significant amount of research and new research into the history of the organisation itself, and also the kind of longer, wider history of humanism and the impact of the non-religious in the UK. So that's where I came in. So I saw the role advertised essentially. At the time, I was working on another heritage project, which was actually focused on railways. And the kind of everything about the Humanist Heritage Project basically sounded perfect for me. It kind of drew together all of my own interests. I would say that I probably have always been a humanist. I did actually go to Catholic schools for middle and high school, Catholic state schools, but I didn't really have a particularly religious background otherwise. Neither of my parents are religious, and I was always just mostly a little bit confused, I think, by everything at school. Definitely didn't know how to make the sign of the cross or anything when I first showed up.
All right.
But yeah, by the time I joined Humanist UK in 2019, I had, as I say, been working on this other project for a couple of years. I'd done a master's in cultural heritage and museum studies, and done a bit of other stuff beforehand, done some teaching and some other work in museums. So it was just kind of like the things I was interested in and the things that I would like to think I'm good at.
So, I mean, one, I can relate to the experience of Catholicism driving you away from religion. That makes total sense to us. But for us, especially being on the other side of the Atlantic and getting little bits and pieces here, we're trying to put together this full quilt from a few threads that we've picked up. We've heard a bit about free thinkers, but this is a very different historical lineage in the UK, isn't it?
There's a lot of crossover, I think, and we do talk about free thinkers and free thought as well. So the Union of Ethical Societies, as Humanists UK was when it began, started in the came together in 1896, as I say, but the ethical societies themselves had existed about 10 years before that. But they were in turn the product, really, of Felix Adler, who was American, and his ethical culture movement, which had started in 1876 in New York. So there's that kind of direct link, certainly with the kind of North American tradition there, but then also with the Union of Ethical Society. Certainly they emerged into what was already a really rich free thought tradition in the UK. So you had all that 19th century free thought, you had positivism and Owenism and secularism and those kind of organized movements, and then obviously this much longer tradition of skepticism, heresy, all of the kind of, questioning and challenge that had been happening for hundreds of years beforehand. So it's a real a real mix. And I do find the kind of comparison between the various countries super interesting.
Yeah, and so it's the same union of ethical societies, or the same sort of starting point. Maybe not maybe starting point's the wrong word. It's the same ethical societies that existed in the US, though.
Yeah, so that's something that, as I say, is really interesting to me, and the influence of Americans is really interesting to me in the kind of origins of the Union of Ethical Societies. So yeah, the first Ethical Culture Society was founded by Felix Adler in New York in 1876, and that was on this notion or this basis of not by the creed but by the deed. So joining people together to be actively good without having to agree on kind of external or supernatural beliefs or ideas. And then there was a kind of direct influence through figures like Stanton Coit, who came over from the US, having been part of that Ethical Culture Society of New York, and kind of brought that over. And then there was also the kind of literature of that movement, which also spread. So when that gets kind of first taken up in the UK with the ethical societies, the various ethical societies that spring up, they're very influenced by that American movement and by that philosophy of practical ethics, I guess. So actually turning what can potentially be fairly abstract ideas into something a bit more concrete. And that varied loads between the ethical societies, but that was the basic premise. So you had Stanton Coit, who was a really leading figure in the early ethical societies and in the Union of Ethical Societies. And then you also had people like Moncure Conway, who, again, another American, an abolitionist. Obviously, Nathan, you know a lot about Moncure Conway. And you've got that, again, that joining into that other, I guess, kind of main thread of the ethical societies, which is Conway Hall and South Place and Red Lion Square, which had begun as a dissenting congregation hundreds of years earlier and had kind of gradually moved towards what is now humanism.
Yeah, I think when I was doing my own book, which I can just
Plug.
just give a short plug for, Race in a Godless World. I did find that, like, yeah, there's a ton of, like you say, Maddie, like a lot of sort of cross fertilization, I guess, from American to British and vice versa. Well, I guess I can ask, like, how did we get from sort of the ethical societies to humanism?
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the question, isn't it? Really, because originally, and I think Stanton Coit himself really hated the word humanism, but I think it was associated with slightly different philosophies like pragmatism and stuff, which I'm probably not qualified to talk about. Um,
Okay.
but certainly originally, and this is I guess what's interesting. One of the things that's interesting about the original ethical societies was that, as I say, they were focused on this idea of deed, not creed. So you didn't have to say that you didn't believe in a religion. You didn't have to expressly be atheist or even agnostic, although they were generally considered to be agnostic societies. So you could theoretically have been a member of an ethical society and still been affiliated to a religious faith, but it was really as the I guess, well, like anything else, as the years went on, that shifted and changed, and you have the word humanist and the idea of the humanist movement start to become really much more widely used and much more used within the ethical societies themselves. In, I guess, the first half of the 20th century, really, you start to see it in the kind of self-conception of the ethical union as it was by then, by the 1920s. And then really from the kind of 1940s, I would say, onwards, they're really thinking about and talking about humanism in the sense that we would describe it now. So very definitely a non-religious philosophy. And then being non-religious organizations and even potentially considering themselves as that kind of alternative to religion, which humanism potentially offers for some people, and sometimes calling it a religion as well, although that's a controversial one, of course.
Did that occur a lot in the UK, where they were calling it referring to humanism as a religion?
Um, it's honestly really mixed, and it changes between individuals and over time. So some people definitely, particularly at, again, I guess I guess that kind of like transition point almost where they are coming to define themselves as humanists. So again, the kind of 40s and 50s, and you do hear it referred to or see it referred to then as sometimes certainly as a faith or a kind of alternative faith. And I think again that draws on that idea that I suppose to an extent we still have today, where we want it to seem like and be perceived as not just a negation of belief. It's not about, or not fully emphasizing what it is that you don't believe in, but also saying, we do believe in other things, just not in God or
Yeah.
a God.
Has that been
Um,
resolved at this point, or are there things that are pretty definitively part of the positive philosophy of humanism?
so certainly for Humanists UK, their definition and the definition that we use is very much, it is a non-religious philosophy. Humanism and humanists are atheist or agnostic. It's not, and it's diluted by those terms of referring to it as secular humanism or whatever, because it suggests that, I guess, though, all of those things aren't captured by the word humanism
Right.
itself.
Right,
Mm.
right.
And again, I think that does vary between individuals and also between organizations and also between countries, because I think you get like the words secular humanism used together, I think, much more in, say, the US, whereas certainly in the way that we use it, it encapsulates that. So it has the atheist and agnostic element of it, but it's more than that. It's a kind of philosophy for living, which is fuller, and it's about believing in those other positive values, kind of beyond just that definition.
Mm.
Yeah. There's on the Humanist UK site, I think that's still there. There's a quiz you can do. It's called like How Humanist Are You?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember doing it, and I got 100% humanist.
Yeah.
So that, yeah. I guess, I mean, I definitely see humanism as kind of like the sort of the flip side of like atheism, which is maybe more about what you don't believe, and humanism is what you do.
Yeah, I do think, like, I find this now, I mean, especially giving talks about humanist heritage to, say, branches and groups around the UK which are humanist groups. And it's interesting then speaking to people and the things people ask, because it's so much about self-definition for lots of people. And so some people would refer to themselves as an atheist just as much as they would maybe use the term humanist. And a lot of it depends, I guess, as well on kind of where you're coming from and who you're talking to and what it is that you're trying to get across. But I think certainly, so like the How Humanist Are You quiz, that's essentially, do you have a rational way of looking at the world? Do you base your beliefs in kind of science and logic? Do you believe that we should be nice to other people? All of those kind of things that are, yeah, like as you say, are kind of beyond just the atheism, like the not believing type thing.
Mm. Which I think is, well, it's tough to compare to humanism or secular humanism in the US because, I mean, one thing is like it's not well established, it's not very prominent. It's
Mm-hmm.
usually, I think we talked about the history of it a little bit on the podcast before, and it was really just this sort of the moral majority's boogeyman in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, it presents a challenge for really examining the history in the U.S. where it's not prominent. You have to do a lot of digging. There are people who have either been sort of intentionally scrubbed out of history, people like Thomas Paine, who was
Mm-hmm.
very prominent at the Revolution and then immediately got whitewashed out of it, and other people like Helen Hamilton Gardner, who we talked about on the show, who just kind of overlooked and ignored, like not part of mainstream history. Is this something that you've been confronted with for the project in the UK, or are these individuals, are these ideas more well known, more established, easier to find out about?
I think so much of it is to do with kind of both, I guess, the assumptions that we often have are often presented with about history and about the history of, I guess, our respective countries, like, oh, this is a Christian country, or this has long been a Christian ruled or a Christian majority country, which often suggests that there is a lot more kind of orthodoxy in belief than there actually is. And also, as you say, I think we do definitely, and you definitely find it here as well, that notion of atheism and free thinkers and, whatever names you want to give to them. So, earlier on, deists and Owenites and the kind of socialists and all of that, those kind of deliberately, I guess, provocative is the wrong word because they weren't using it to be provocative themselves, but in their kind of presentation of them, they were those words were calculated. And so I think we do see that, and that's why in the history you get at various points people defining and creating new words to talk about those kind of sets of beliefs. So you get T.H. Huxley in 1869 inventing the word agnosticism because it captures something about that kind of dwelling in doubt that atheism doesn't quite do. And also George Jacob Holyoake creating secularism again, when he first coins that term in 1851, he's aware of the stigma of the word atheism, and so that's addressing that, and it's essentially synonymous with humanism as we would define it now. It's an earthly philosophy that's based on what you can see and what you can do, but it's partly been created because atheism and atheist is such a kind of shocking word. And as for those people being kind of lost to history or kind of hidden, I think that's very much true. And that was one of the reasons that the Humanist Heritage Project was kind of created, I suppose, in the first place, was that typically in biographies of the kind of great and the good that we come across, if they were motivated by a very strong religious belief, it's very much part of the way that they're described. It's very much discussed in their biographies. We know if somebody was, a devout Christian or whatever it was, and that's seen as part of what motivated them. If they didn't have those beliefs, or if they didn't appear to attend church or whatever it might be, often that's just kind of left out. You don't really get a mention of it either way. So when we're looking at people in history and trying to figure out what was it that they did believe, there's all sorts of things that make it complicated. That being one, that sometimes you're getting a sense of what it is that they did or didn't believe from what they didn't do or what they didn't say, as opposed to what they did, or how they were buried, or what kind of
Yes, right.
all of those types of things. And also, obviously, the further you go back, it's even more difficult because when it was not only socially unacceptable, but actually dangerous and potentially illegal to express ideas that would be atheist or humanist in their expression, then that's people really were at risk. So again, you've got much more veiled expressions of what people did believe, if they're expressing it at all. So it is hard. And I think people's so yeah, as you say, Tom Paine's a great example. Only 6 people attended his funeral, so tragic, and yet he was this incredibly influential figure, and influential on free thinkers and humanists for generations afterwards. But because of the kind of radicalism of, I guess, various aspects of his philosophy, he was, for a long time not appreciated as much as he maybe should have been.
Mm-hmm. I guess one of the things you've been doing with the project is working on sort of expanding or creating Wikipedia entries for human. Is that true?
Yeah.
Okay. And I was just going to ask, in addition to that, what have you learned from doing this project?
Oh, that's good. So much. I say this everywhere and to everyone and everything, but definitely how many women were involved in the movement. That's been I think the big one for me. Not necessarily in terms of, oh, I'm so surprised that women have always thought for themselves,
Right.
but definitely that again, it's those figures who maybe haven't been celebrated or appreciated as much. Definitely so in terms of the ethical societies themselves. And in the early years, you had this kind of legion of of women who were really involved and kind of like propelling the whole movement, whose names we didn't even really know until we started to look properly at the minute books and the kind of records of the societies, and you see these names coming up again and again. So that was really interesting to me. And then I suppose that links a bit with all the other things that they were involved in, which again, I think one of the big, I guess, I don't know if I would say conclusions maybe, but definitely one of the things that I have found really interesting, but again, not necessarily surprising from the project, is that idea that lots of these figures, men and women, were involved in all of these kind of hugely wide-ranging areas of activism and social reform, and lots of that was to do with the kind of very premise of free thinking that lies behind, obviously, atheism and humanism, because they were willing to question the kind of received ideas of what was moral or legal or whatever it might be, and felt they had this duty to change them. So I guess all the way through you've got all of these very, very principled, motivated, non-religious people doing all these incredible things that we didn't necessarily know about or celebrate as much. So I guess that's been the big one.
But that's great. So they're finally putting faces and names to a lot of the actions. And it sounds like it confirms what we expect to find, right? That it is sort of multifaceted, it's wide ranging. Like, what was some of the things that they did accomplish in terms of being practically good?
Yeah, so basically, so much stuff, and we're working on this thing at the moment, this history of humanism in 100 objects, and that's really drawing on a lot of this, really these different things that actually humanists and the non-religious have been really involved in making enormous changes within. So certainly, with kind of changes in the law. So humanists were really active in campaigning for changes in laws regarding marriage and divorce, regarding reproductive rights and access to birth control and abortion, and all of those things that I suppose, as you say, you would probably expect to find the humanists in there. But then also other movements and other efforts for change, like, for example, the peace movements and campaign for nuclear disarmament and stuff like that in, I guess, comparatively more recent decades, where they can be, not always, and this isn't also, I should say, to discredit the work of people who are religious and who are motivated by that, but certainly there's sometimes this sense of like, oh, pacifists and people who've worked for nuclear disarmament are probably doing so from a kind of religious standpoint, because I suppose again, it's those assumptions and those kind of the ways that we're used to understanding that. So we think of, for example, conscientious objectors during the wars as arguing that from a religious standpoint, whereas actually there's, all the way through, there's also people who are non-religious trying to work for the same things. And of course, then you get things that touch kind of directly on freedom of speech and freedom of belief. So things like, challenging the blasphemy laws, and an incredibly long history of working for freedom of the press and freedom of speech. Again, which you would probably expect, but still, it's nice to nice to confirm it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. Yeah. I think, like on the issue of divorce, I mean, I think maybe people take for granted, like how difficult it used to, or like impossibly difficult it used to be, like to get divorced in the 19th century and maybe beyond. But I mean, well, just going back to something you were saying earlier about about the number of women involved, maybe it's obvious, like with regard to divorce or whatever, things like this. Like, well, why do you think so many women were drawn to free thought and humanism?
Yeah, I think, and there's been obviously some really amazing scholarship on this. So, or I would definitely say, like Barbara Taylor's book, Even the New Jerusalem, and also Laura Schwartz, Infidel Feminism, both done really great writing on this, on what I guess appealed to women in these movements, as well as the role they played in them, which had often been overlooked before then. But I think the ideas of equality that come with getting rid of kind of biblical concepts of hierarchy and of male dominance and female subservience are pretty appealing now still, and so I definitely find that interesting, and I find that a very, I guess, logical reason why so many women would be drawn to the kind of organized free thought movements, because there was a lot of potential for greater equality and greater roles in things, and all of that. In fact, I was just thinking about this before we started recording. Emma Martin, who's one of my, I guess, personal favourites, born in 1812, started out as a really zealous Baptist. She was raised in that faith and was incredibly well versed in the Bible, a really powerful kind of speaker. And it was in that context that she first got introduced to Owenism, in fact, because she started offering herself to debate Owenite and socialist lecturers. And gradually found herself kind of won over to the cause.
Wow.
And the thing that she found really appealing was the fact that it didn't put any restrictions on the use of her own reason. It didn't require her to kind of bend or twist her reason or stop herself in any sense. She was completely kind of free to exercise that and to pursue a kind of grounding for morality, which was much richer, I suppose, than just being told what it was that you should think. So I think she's a really interesting example, because once she was kind of won round, she became this kind of fearsome lecturer for the other side, and this incredibly popular and prominent lecturer for Owenism, and a very outspoken atheist. In fact, such a kind of powerful speaker and potentially controversial speaker that she won herself a few enemies as well, and she ended her life as a midwife, which I also find somehow really touching. She kind of retreated from this very public sphere and went into private practice as a midwife, couldn't practice or couldn't work in a hospital because of her atheism.
Wow.
Again, interesting.
Right.
And died in 1852, so she was pretty young when she died. But I think it's women like that really, I guess, help to illustrate what it might have been that drew women to it. And I think all the way through, and once again you get to the kind of ethical societies and the women who were active in those, I think one of the things that must have drawn them was that there was this very clear support for women's rights and for suffrage in particular, which lots of the women who were involved in the ethical societies in those early years were actively involved with. And you get writers like Zona Valence, who was kind of technically the first chief executive of Humanists UK. She was a founder of the Union of Ethical Societies, really, and she was writing all this stuff about how, once we rid ourselves of the idea through science and through increased understanding of the kind of hierarchies that we've been used to and the order of the world that the Bible and religion has given us, we're free to completely remake things. And that's a hugely positive and exciting thing for everyone, including women, who can suddenly be involved in things and be pursuing things that they were blocked off from before. So that's a very long-winded answer.
No, but I mean, it ends in a great place where like women do become the force, part of the force that remakes the world in the way that they want it. It sounds like it moves from an opening, like an open space, right? Where women suddenly have this freedom to do it, and then they manage to move into positions of leadership. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair to say, and kind of carve those spaces for themselves, which is not obviously to say that you didn't have male leaders and male figures in there, those movements, but being able to occupy those positions, especially in comparison to not every, but a lot of religious denominations during the 19th century and earlier, didn't have those spaces for women. So it was powerful to be able to be a lecturer, an organizer, a leader.
Yeah, and it's a powerful lesson for today too, where we know the numbers are slanted towards men in like strong atheist communities. But do
Mm-hmm.
we know? Do you have a sense of what the numbers were historically? In like, was there a gender balance in humanists?
Yeah, I mean, so that's one of the things that was really interesting, actually, looking at the membership and subscriber lists of the ethical societies. So we've got some really good records, particularly a couple of the societies, two of the London societies, the West London and the Hampstead societies. We've got particularly good records for, and this was kind of like a bit of a lockdown project for me, because I had a load of photos from the Bishopsgate archive, where those archives are kept, and just where I'd like taken obsessive photos of all of these documents. And so I did quite a lot of actually looking up, as far as was possible, who the members were, and what professions they had, and where they were living, and whether they were involved in other things, which is how I found out a lot about some of the particularly interesting members who we can categorically say have a historic humanist involvement, as opposed to just, as we were saying before, thinking, oh, they're probably humanists because they don't seem to have any mention of them going to church or whatever. But yeah, in those societies, it was roughly even. It was about 50-50. And that did help to, I guess, dispel that idea that it's always been a very male dominated movement. I think so with some of the other kind of organised movements like the secularist movement, I think they did tend to be fairly male heavy, but at the same time there were still lots of women who were not just members and kind of present there, but also were kind of actively part of the kind of leadership and the organisation of them. But certainly with the ethical societies, it was much more evenly split in the kind of, certainly the first kind of few decades of the Union of Ethical Societies, which is really interesting. Obviously, I'd say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to hear more about the 100 objects you were working on. That sounds like a fun project.
Oh,
What objects have you found that really stood out to you so far?
Yeah, it's been super fun. So we're releasing them 10 each week until we get to the full 100. So this week is, I think, the fifth week. So we'll be releasing objects 40 to
Mm.
50. Yeah, that sounds right. But yeah, it's been really interesting to think both kind of what objects in general kind of exemplify the history and philosophy, I suppose, of humanism, but also who is represented and how are they represented. So it's everything from, I don't know, like Harriet Martineau's ear trumpet to stuff that's a little bit more kind of maybe obvious, like certain key texts or key
Mm.
letters, busts of notable people, badges of certain things like the CND badge. So yeah,
CND?
it's really
That's the
varied.
that's is that campaign for nuclear
Oh,
Oh
wow.
yeah,
disarmament.
sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, the peace sign, which is kind of like ubiquitous now in our kind of association with, I guess, peace and like ban the bomb in general, but did come from the original kind of campaign for
Oh,
nuclear
wow.
disarmament
Oh, I
campaign.
didn't
Huh.
know that. Interesting.
That's clever.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is actually super interesting because it's apparently supposed to kind of represent the idea of like a human being standing with their kind of arms open, um,
Oh.
which you can see with the kind of lines of the peace sign.
And
But
cut off at the
uh,
waist, I suppose.
yeah, and then and also supposedly the semaphore symbols for N and D, so nuclear disarmament, which I think are um, captured in
Wow.
there, but I'm not.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And it's an artifact that
Yeah.
slipped into mainstream society everywhere.
Yeah, which is, I mean, again, not dissimilar to like the humanist symbol, the happy
Mm.
human, which obviously not probably quite the same reach in the sense that the kind of peace sign or the ban the bomb symbol has been. I mean, you get that on like T-shirts and stuff now, with all sorts of things. But again, the humanist symbol, the happy human, was just the result of a competition run by the British Humanist Association in the 60s, won by
Huh.
Dennis Barrington. And then, you've seen it since then in all of these different incarnations and used by humanist organizations across the world, which again is kind of cool when you start to look down a bit more at the history of some of these symbols and,
Yeah.
things we
Mm.
don't
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, that's really cool. I didn't know that about the peace sign. What was I gonna say? Oh yeah, I mean, I really like the idea too of like humanism in objects. I mean, or the history of it in objects, because it's not. Yeah, I mean, obviously, like the ideas and things are really what matters, but it's also like the physical stuff sometimes, which is also important. I just remember like when I was doing research for my my book.
Yeah.
Another plug.
Link below.
Um, yeah. Just like there would always be stuff in like periodicals, like okay, like you must buy this picture of Robert Ingersoll or something like
Yeah,
this
they
famous.
love that.
Like you must buy this picture and like and display it in your home because I think for Christians at the time it was a sort of similar thing where you'd have like a Bible or something displayed prominently on your mantle, and
Yeah,
then
that's so
like
true. Yeah.
yeah, like for secular people, like they've got something sort of similar, like objects or whatever, and yeah, like to put in their house to kind of signal their affiliation or whatever.
Yeah, that's totally true. And then I guess as well how the objects that were then chosen for spaces that were deliberately secular or humanist, what do you put in those? And that's something that is
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
really interesting as well. And I think interesting historically for, I mean, the history of Humanist UK and the Union of Ethical Societies, because they did stuff. So again, to go back to Stanton Coit, he created this ethical church, which was a secular space, but very much designed to kind of emulate I guess that sense of adoration or worship that you might get in a church, except the busts that were there were like Emerson and Josephine Butler, a campaigner against the Contagious Diseases Act, and he had stained glass, which was like George Bernard Shaw, and all of these kind of subversions of those things. And then you get like the busts at the Leicester Secular Hall, which are a real mix because you get some religious figures among them because you can still admire somebody who's religious, or who is associated with religion for the kind of values they've preached, for want of a better word. Um, but yeah, I think it is really interesting. It's kind of what I guess what we have for those, and because it's something that gets, I know with Humanists UK and the school speakers, we have school speakers, a network of people who can go into schools to talk about humanism, and often they get asked things like that because when kids in school are learning about religions, they're learning about, this is the book that they use, and this is the festival they celebrate, and this is the special whatever item or something that stands in for those things, and so often there are those questions about like, well, what's the humanist equivalent
Mm.
of those things?
Yes, right, right.
And in some ways it's like, well, it's everything, every
Yeah.
book is a
Right.
a
Right. Yes,
humanist
right.
bible, every or you can just as easily answer like that, I suppose. But it is interesting to have those objects that kind of stand in for the values and the kind of the philosophy, which can be a bit abstract, I suppose, the
Yeah.
kind of
Were
personal
there
history.
sort of like holidays associated with humanism,
um
or any that exist today? Are they related to humanist studies?
I mean, I think the closest we have is Darwin Day, really. And again, I think it's to encourage people to think about the values of those, and for there to be a day where we're celebrating and marking those values. But I think in the sense of kind of other ones, again, it's interesting. In certain societies, certain ones of the ethical societies introduced certain days. So the ethical church had Woman Sunday, which was an annual celebration
Okay.
to show support for suffrage and for women's rights, and they had a few others that were similar to that. But I think there's definitely this sense of not wanting to go back to the kind of like the positivists and the Church of Humanity, with this idea of, you know, having a whole calendar of celebration days for different kind of people and things that were admired, which was kind of quasi religious. And I think lots of people who step away from that, that's not what they want or need necessarily.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I don't know what you guys think about
Yeah.
that, but
Yeah. Well, one thing that just sort of came to mind, I don't know if you haven't, do you have Labor Day in the UK?
no.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to look
I was
stupid
just,
if we
But you
do,
have
but I
May
don't think so.
Day.
no, I
May
mean,
Day's bigger.
Oh yeah, May Day. Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. I was just sort of thinking, like, I'm just looking it up to see. It looks like, yeah, like, I guess we in Canada and the US have it early September, I guess, and then whereas you guys have May Day,
Yeah.
1st of May.
International Workers'
But I
Day
think, like,
is May Day. Let's
yes,
just say
right,
the
right.
humanists invented a little holiday called the weekend.
Yeah, or that, yeah,
52
yes,
times
that's,
a year.
yeah,
Yeah.
You're welcome. You're welcome, everyone.
yes, yeah, yes, yes. If you enjoy your
That was
weekend, thank a
us.
humanist.
Boom.
I mean, yeah, but I think, obviously, it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, the people behind it were probably first and foremost like socialist or whatever, but they might also be considered humanist. I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
and there's a lot of crossover, and I think that's the thing again that's kind of come out of a lot of this research. For me, I'm not saying I'm like the first person to have ever discovered it, but there's definitely there is quite a lot of crossover, and certainly like with the kind of Labour and the socialist movements, there's a huge amount of crossover there between socialism and the kind of non-religious and secular values and secularism as well, and so lots of the kind of leading figures there, and lots of the kind of platforms were shared, and you would have people speaking to kind of both things. And I guess as well, and maybe it's that kind of thing that we've touched on a bit before, but it kind of makes sense if you are embracing that. So like Holyoake's definition of secularism, which is, we don't know if there's anything else, so we might as well work to make change now because we can see it, and we want to do that. I think that it makes a lot of sense that then you do get that activism for, workers' rights, for better conditions for everyone, if that's your starting point. Which again, not to say that all of those people were non-religious, but there were certainly a large number of them, and a large number of the kind of key movers who were.
But I think it speaks to something else that I think is important and often gets overlooked, or at least it gets sort of like shunted aside with atheism. It sounds like humanism isn't totalizing, right? It's not the whole of your existence the way a religion would be. Where religion talks about every aspect of your life, and it sets what the rites of passage are, and it defines who you are from birth to death and beyond. Whereas humanism is an opening, and it's one of many other things. It leads to other things. It doesn't have to be one thing. Is that a fair takeaway, or am I talking up my butt again?
No, I think that's a really nice way of putting it, actually. I think that if humanism is a kind of philosophy for a living and a way of living, a kind of actual, a kind of set of values, I guess. And so we're drawing our kind of influence for all of those things from all sorts of places, not one holy book or not one parish sermon or whatever it might be. And I think that's probably why there are, huge numbers of people who may well not self-define as humanist, may not even know what the word is, but would probably score 100% on
Yeah.
the how humanist are you quiz, because, I think for lots of people it's almost like a bit of a kind of common sense philosophy. Yeah, we care about other people. Yeah, we believe in science. Yeah, we want to live well with other people. And I think lots of people, that is their where they're
Man, that
coming
sounds
from.
like a wonderful summary. It's a pretty good takeaway. We're good people who do nice things, believe in science.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, with that in mind, I think we should move on to the lightning round called normally we call this Can a True Atheist? And it's just yes, no questions. Feel free to elaborate on it. They're not trick questions. Nathan, have I forgotten any of the rules?
No, I don't think so. Just that we're going to call it Can a
True
True Humanist for
humanist.
you.
Thank you.
Yes. And it's not, it's just tongue
Yeah.
in cheek for the
And it's
moment.
not legally binding.
Not legally
No,
binding.
exactly.
You can contradict yourself even. It's pretty great.
Oh,
Yes.
perfect.
Yes. Yeah.
Count me in.
All right. Okay. Can a true humanist believe in God?
No.
Is that definitional
Okay.
now? It's not like in the past?
Or is it? Here's the elaboration part.
Right.
I think if you're using humanist in the definition that I would use it, no, you don't. You don't
Mhm.
believe in God or gods. It's that kind of atheism, agnosticism is part of it. You may well not absolutely discount the possibility of there being a God, because again, unless we're certain that there is absolutely no way, no evidence that could prove it. But I would say no.
All right.
I'm going to stick to it.
No
Okay.
wrong answers.
Okay.
Can a true humanist consider themselves religious or spiritual?
Oh, see, religious and spiritual, I would say, are
Mm.
different things. Um, and again, it's a definitional thing once again with religion, I suppose, because I went to a talk not too long ago where the speaker was talking about the roots of the word meaning to bind, and that we need to kind of bring back a kind of religious concept, not necessarily in the sense of like a religious faith, but that so can a true humanist be religious? I would say probably no. Spiritual,
Ooh,
yeah,
all right.
sure, if you want.
Okay. Can a true humanist eat meat?
Oh, see, you're talking to a vegan here, so
Oh, right. Okay.
Going around.
this is this is not the Humanist UK
Okay.
line, but I can give you my own my own belief.
Yes.
Actually, no, that sounds so. A true humanist should be able to think for themselves and
Okay.
arrive at their decision based on their own reason and
Right.
compassion. This humanist
Uh-huh.
does not eat meat,
Okay.
because I'm expanding that compassion to all sentient
Mhm.
creatures.
All right, that's good. Can a true humanist vandalize a church?
Ooh, no. um, it's respect for other belief systems, isn't it? I think there is this whole, I guess the key thing and the key message for humanism is it's not about wanting every other person in the world to be humanist. It's not a belief that everybody should be, or that the world would be better if they were. It's just advocating for a world where plurality is possible and where those things can coexist. So no.
Fantastic.
Mhm. Can a true humanist believe in an afterlife?
Again, I would say no, except for the humanist notion of an afterlife, which is that we live on in the deeds we've done and the memories of the people who liked and loved us, and those things that we leave behind. But an afterlife in the heaven, hell, reincarnation sense, no.
All right. Can a true humanist believe in aliens?
Oh, yeah, you got it. It's totally possible. Yeah, I'd like to think there's maybe some aliens out there.
Right.
Seems arrogant to consider that we're the only
Mm-hmm.
ones.
Mhm.
And this next question, the last question, is completely different.
Mhm. Yeah. Can a true humanist support the monarchy?
Ooh.
Yes.
Okay.
I think this is again, I'm pretty sure that lots of people and lots of members and supporters of Humanists UK either support or at the very least feel relatively apathetic about the monarchy. I think obviously it would be the idea of the monarch as the kind of head of the church and the kind of state church. That's a different thing. But I think the monarchy itself, yeah.
They're all right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, yeah, thanks so much, Maddie, for talking with us. Is there anything you want to let people know about the project? Where can people find it, etc.?
Yeah, so please do check out the Humanist Heritage website, which is just heritage.humanists.uk, or you can search Humanist Heritage and hopefully
Yeah.
it's
Yeah,
popular enough now
yeah,
that it'll be the
we
first one
can.
to show up.
Yeah.
And also, I have written a couple of things for the Humanist, as in the website of the American Humanist Association, about some of the connections between the kind of American and UK movements. So I know we talked a little bit about that. So if anyone's interested, there's a couple of things I've written on their website, and there should be another one soon. So yeah, Humanist
Excellent. And
Heritage.
we'll
All
definitely
right.
we'll have
Great.
everything linked below. Maddie, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
That was Maddy Goodall, the coordinator for the Humanist Heritage Project from Humanist UK. Nathan, what's your big takeaway from that?
Just that I think the project's really important, and I think it's really cool. And they're building a really sort of comprehensive resource, I think, for people.
Yeah, it looks that way. What makes it important, Nathan? Tell us.
Oh, I mean, well, I think, atheist and humanist groups, they didn't just spring up out of nothing. They have this long history. And I think it's important to understand, where the movement has been, what its contributions have been, what are the kind of humanist values that you can see in history, stuff like this. I mean, yeah, I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah,
What
especially when
what
it
did
ends
you,
with like it ends with where we are now, right? So it's part of the story of how we get here and like to this point in history, and to go back and see like the people sort of defining our history and our culture, saying these are the people who are important. This is what they did. This is how they did it, and this is the change that they wrought. That's important. That's a
hmm
great finding, and the way she's doing it is super interesting. That like it's even in the attendance of meetings, right?
yeah.
Like that tells you about the value of the people. You can go back to Victorian England and find a place where you have rough forms of gender equality. You can find places where you have women and men sharing leadership positions, and we can document it because they had a meeting. That's there's some good archaeology there. It's cultural archaeology, and I love that we can find that and present it as part of our history.
hmm
I
Yeah,
mean, the
definitely.
thing that I hope this really leads to here is like that other people are paying attention and doing it for themselves in the groups here. Because it's one thing to hear like, yeah, we know that there is a lineage, there's a branch that connects it back to the U.S. I'm here in the United States. It might be like we might feel a little disconnected from that, but it's part of the same thread, and we've just got to fill in the blanks on our side of the Atlantic, and that's there for us to do.
Yeah. I think one thing that's important about the history of humanism and atheism and secularism and so on is that since it's mostly kind of about ideas, is I think it's ideas obviously can cross borders easily. I think so. I think that's one of the sort of great things about this history is that it's not confined to one nation. Like it's a global story, really. I think.
That's true.
Um,
Part of the values.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, yeah. Well, a couple of months we talked with Lee Schmidt, and there was that quote from Thomas Paine
Mhm.
about the world is my country.
Yeah,
Yeah, the
yeah,
world is my
right.
country.
Yeah,
And I think I think that's, yeah, part of the value too is that these are aspirationally universal values. You know, it's not just sort of confined to one nation or whatever. So I think that's another important point too.
oh yeah, and I mean to get Certainly. I mean, thank you for tarring us as globalists. That'll come in handy.
Yes.
Um,
Right.
but that, like, the linkages, they don't just go one way. They don't just go two way. They go
Mm-hmm.
every direction, right? They just
Mm-hmm.
haven't been uncovered
Yeah.
yet. They haven't been stylized and real and put down on paper yet. That history is out there for us to uncover, but it informs us now. And I mean, it led to like the realization that there are symbols that we live with every day that have this incredible birth in humanism that we didn't expect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was really interested to learn about the peace sign, being relatively recent invention coming from the campaign for nuclear disarmament. Something I never really gave any thought to. I mean, like, where does the symbol come from? It just sort of seems like some kind of natural symbol that has existed since the beginning of time, or
Right?
something that
Yeah.
this definitely stands for peace.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah,
Or,
but I think
or came from
it
hippies.
highlights, yeah, right. But it highlights something that, like, many of these social movements were, humanists either led or played a big part in, and maybe we don't always know that because the history isn't super well told, I guess. So I think that's important.
Yeah, I mean, and part of it is we know that like a lot of it, like what happened to Thomas Paine, like it gets obscured, it gets kind of
Yeah,
talked over
that's
again.
another thing too.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, yeah, even just to take an example from the U.S., like the civil rights movement, there were a ton of non-religious people involved, and today it's mostly looked at as like a religious or a Christian movement, and definitely, obviously, Christians were involved, and Christianity was very important in different aspects of it. But, like, it's not, we shouldn't just completely wipe away the contributions of atheists and secularists and humanists to that.
right. Because it doesn't fit the narrative that our society wants to posit, which omits the biggest part, which is the opponents of civil rights were
Right.
almost
Yes,
all entirely Christian.
that's another good point.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
and
Hmm.
especially in terms of the symbology, it's quite telling, right? Like this symbol is known for peace and was invented by, well, if you just think of like the most well-known sign of peace, you'd think of the peace symbol, right? The
Hmm.
Christian narrative would be no, it would be the cross. And a good
Yeah.
response is that's not what first of all, Christians didn't invent that. I think the Romans did, and it didn't mean peace at the time, did it?
Right.
It meant
Right.
something
Exactly.
very
Yeah.
different.
I think there's some quote from, I think it's George Carlin, telling about, like, if Jesus lived in Texas in the 20th century, like, people, Christians would be like wearing like a little, like, electric chair necklaces and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Wearing a cross for Jesus is like wearing a rifle for JFK.
Hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Yep. We're
Hmm.
hitting a lot of tangents now, but before I forget, there is a George Carlin special on HBO or documentary
Oh, okay.
that
Oh,
I
right.
would
Okay.
recommend because I mean, it's also it might be part of our American history of humanists, which it's
Hmm.
yet to be written, right?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, there's been historical works on this topic, but I mean, I think, yeah, there's still a lot more to do, more ground to cover.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, and it's great because it informs what people like us have believed, what they've gone through, how they overcame, and contributions to the world now. It should not be forgotten that like it's the peace symbol is made by people who don't believe in God. That's
Hmm.
right. That's important.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah, yeah. I think another important point about, like, why learning about the history is important is just that, for example, I mean, in previous episodes, we talked about atheists' attempts to kind of have like rituals and so on, and, like, like the Sunday assembly kind of place, a similar place like church, I suppose, to to build community and so on. And I mean, there's been well, like the ethical societies, they've been at this for over 100 years. I think, yeah, it's useful to, like, just to know that, or to learn from some of these examples, like, yeah, what maybe didn't work or what did and so on. Yeah.
Totally, totally. Yeah, and to just to really throw it back to Maddie's work, the 100 objects that she was talking about,
Yeah.
like having the sort of history crystallized into something physical or something that we can remember it better
Yeah.
makes it a
Yeah.
bit more meaningful.
Yeah, it's a really good
Yeah,
point.
and I mean, so having this exist, it's a great resource. You'll find lots of fantastic stuff. You'll start to make these connections, and hopefully, going forward, like you said, right? Like we've got it gives us these examples of what people have been through. Yeah, it's great. It's part of what makes us. Well, hopefully, it's our burgeoning culture.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, there's one plug. There's the plug for the Humanist Heritage. If you want to check out and find out if you are indeed a humanist yourself, you can go to the Humanist UK website. Odds are, if you're listening to this because you want to, I'm going to guess you're going to get 90 to 100% anyway.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but check out the resources there. Anything else you want to plug?
We should encourage people to check out our Patreon. We've got a bonus segment with Maddie where we talk a little bit more about well, we talked in the main episode about positive things about humanists, but like where I asked about whether there's any humanists she came across that she didn't like.
Ooh, the dirt.
um,
That's where all the good
so
stuff
definitely
is.
check out the bonus section. And we just want to give a thanks to our current patrons, I guess, Lars, Debbie, and the AHS Plus blog. So thank you so much for supporting us.
Thank you very much. Big ups. And thank you to all the listeners. If you want to contribute and become a patron, please check the link below. If not, we understand. There are all sorts of constraints on everyone all the time, but like and subscribe, that would be a big help, and that's free. So yeah, give us the thumbs up, the stars, pull the string, ring the bell, whatever it takes. No cost to you. I've got nothing going on, Nathan. I don't know about what's happening in your world. I have no online commitments. It's very freeing. I don't know. I
Yeah.
don't have. I don't check the Facebook or the Gram or the TikToks. None of that. What about you? Are you still following the news there? You keeping up with
Yeah.
all of the rants and raves from the fans?
Yeah. If you have any rants and raves, you can get in touch on Twitter at Nath G. Alexander.
Yeah. Let us know what you think. Give us
Yeah.
if you've got something you want to talk about on the show, you want to hear about on the show, drop a line. Otherwise, what else do we need to do here? Is that it?
We're
We
good.
are good. We did it. All right, guys. Thanks for
All
listening.
right.
Bye bye.